Caledonian Elixir.
Broadcasting from Glasgow, Scotland, welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. I'm your host Vincent Waller, and you can get involved by calling free from the UK on 0738 745 3353. That is 0738 745 3353. The international number is also available on the screen, or come on by clicking the link on the description. You can also engage with us by leaving live chats, and whether you agree or disagree, it's free, so call in and join the discussion. And we are broadcasting live to multiple platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter X, and Rumble too, I believe. And also up as a podcast on Spotify later, so don't forget to subscribe and follow us there. And you can support us by buying me a coffee, donating at buymeacoffee.com/Caledonian Elixir. There are links on YouTube there to support us and on Twitter. So I hope you're all well today. It's been a hot few days in Scotland. You know, there's only two seasons in Scotland, August and autumn. You know, we usually just get grey skies and rain, and then you get this 30-day interval where it's unbearably warm and humid. Probably not unbearably warm if you're from the United States or the Middle East or some warmer climate, but in Scotland we need time to acclimatise to these conditions. You know, I can't adapt so easily. Once it gets over 25 degrees, I start to struggle. But here on the Elixir, we take a deep dive into the human condition, covering everything from politics to the paranormal, told with wit and true grit, with guests and callers uncensored. And today on the Elixir, we have a guest on, and we will be having a discussion about the Russia-Ukraine war. And this war is a geopolitical quagmire, and the human toll is staggering, with hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, cities destroyed. But this war in reality is global. We're all affected, and that's why we still need to talk about it outside of the dogmatic narrative of the mainstream media. I mean, look, NATO is expanding, Russia and its allies are entrenching, and in the UK there's talk of conscription and a coalition of the willing, which to me doesn't sound like a good idea. But on the other hand, we've seen the red carpet rolled out at the summit in Alaska, the Trump-Putin summit. But in the words of Dave Mustaine, peace sells, but who's buying? So to discuss this more is Bruce Wilkinson. So without further ado, hi, how you doing, Bruce?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Vince. It's a real pleasure. Hello from Olympia, Washington, United States.
Olympia, Washington. Nice. And how's the weather over there?
You know, it sounds like it's kind of similar to the weather in Scotland, actually. We have, I like this, it's like we have rainy, overcast for 8 months out of the year, but we have two to 3 months of pretty warm weather in the summer. Gets up in the 80s. Fahrenheit, I'm really bad at understanding.
See, I'm not too bad if I'm given time, but in Scotland we get roughly like the average in Scotland is something like 12 degrees. And then all of a sudden it transitions and it gets above 25 and it's very humid, and I struggle with those conditions. It takes it out of me. If there was some time to acclimatise and adjust to it, you know, but we don't get that. It's August and autumn here, so
yeah, I have that same problem out here.
But I want to provide an audience a quick synopsis background which is germane to the question I want to ask you. It's sort of how I kind of see the background to this conflict. And there are many routes for this war, but one very important route is the failure of political leadership. And this is an important one. So if you cast our minds back to 2014, we had the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, try to impeach the then Ukrainian President Yanukovych. And that didn't work very well. So not that long afterwards, we had a violent overthrow of Yanukovych. He had to flee to his dacha and then flee to Russia. And this leads to Crimea joining the Russian Federation and a civil war basically funded by the West between the separatists in the Donbass and those funded and supported by the West in Kiev. Fast forward, not long after, we get the Minsk Accords, and that fails with both sides blaming one another. And then we get the outbreak of war, or the SMO, in 2022, followed not long after by the Istanbul Accords, which again falls flat on its ass, doesn't go anywhere. So my question is, considering the background of this war is the failure of political dialogue, political negotiation, example after another example of that, do you have any hopes or aspirations for any successful negotiations following the Trump-Putin summit?
Well, I think you did a good job laying out how I definitely view how this conflict came about. And, I think there's inevitably going to be some negotiation at some point that leads to peace, right? So it's like we can't pretend, unless it's full-on nuclear war, that at some point they're going to negotiate. And I am not ruling out full-on nuclear war at this point at all. Unfortunately, I think the risk is way too high. It should be zero, but it's instead it's probably the closest nuclear war we may have ever been. So, but yeah, I think that inevitably there will be, it's not going to be rushed. The Russian side isn't going to accept less than what they feel that they deserve. They put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this conflict. And same to some degree as the Ukrainians, of course, who put even more blood into the conflict. But frankly, Russia's just gonna win on the military playing field through like their strategy of attrition of the Ukrainian forces. But that's a long, hard process.
I would like to play a quick little clip from the.
Let's do it.
Summit.
Yeah,
you got to admit that was quite an interesting power move by Trump, having the bombers fly overhead there. Do you think the talks are in reality influence the strategy on the battlefield? Because the timing of these talks suddenly announced in the middle of a summer offensive by Russia, it's very coincidental to me. And that's before we even mention the hesitation by Trump to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's trading partners for buying Russian oil and gas. But I think due to Trump's realization it would essentially harm the American economy, he's not going to do that. So maybe I'm just suspicious, but I don't think the real purpose of the summit is to end the war, rather than to alter Russian strategy on the battlefield. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I tend to have to agree on that. So it seems to me that at this point, the Ukrainian side, the NATO and American side, the Western side, wants to freeze the conflict for a while and then prosecute it later because they're losing, right? So that's so for them, some sort of freeze, some ability to move in their troops and stage them, Western troops, NATO troops, the coalition willing into Ukraine while there's something of like a frozen conflict. That's beneficial to them. Then they can work on building up their arms and being able to prosecute the war later. Now this is part of like generally the Western hegemonic order's strategy right now, which is starting and stopping conflicts all over the world. It seems, especially since 2022, where something like an order went out around the world, felt like to like every agency of the CIA, every intelligence agency, which was like just start conflicts everywhere, pull every scheme available. So it's kind of it's like they're using diplomacy, trying to get something out of it to slow down Russia's advance, to try and push Russia to slow down in the hopes of like.
You have both sides essentially entrenched, and I hear in Western media ad nauseum about Russia's maximalist demands, but nothing about Zelensky compromising on territory or membership into NATO. In fact, here's a clip of Zelensky. Sorry, here's.
Шановні українці, українки, президент Трамп оголосив про підготовку своєї зустрічі з Путіним на Алясці. Дуже далеко від цієї війни, яка триває на нашій землі, проти нашого народу, яку все одно не закінчити без нас, без України. Путін не вірив в наших людей, тому ухвалив це своє безнадійне рішення спробувати взяти Україну. Це було його головною помилкою – не зважати на українців. Я вірю в наших людей, бо українці сильні, українці захищають своє. Багато хто в світі став на бік України за час війни. Навіть ті, хто з Росією, знають, що вона чинить зло. Звісно, ми не дамо Росії нагород за зроблене. Український народ заслуговує на мир. Але всі партнери мають розуміти, що таке достойний мир. Цю війну треба закінчувати, і Росія має її закінчити. Росія її почала та затягує, не слухаючи ніякі дедлайни. І саме це проблема.
Right.
Now, my point there is, in the last year, Ukraine has lost its foothold in the Kursk. It's lost the key towns of Adiyevka, Volodar, Chasiv Yar, Pokrovsk is surrounded now. Konstantinivka is caught in a cauldron, and they've got no answer about how they're going to retake the oblasts of Crimea, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, at least not without NATO boots on the ground. Yet Zelensky refuses to compromise. And again, I'm Scottish, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm not Russian, but to me, it appears that the longer this war rolls on, the more men and the more territory Ukraine is going to lose. So why do you think it is that the elites in the West can't see that, if it's clear to me and you?
No, they can see that. They just don't care. I mean, there was a lot of comments early on, in the United States amongst leadership where people are talking about just how, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And they were talking about how this is the cheapest war for the United States. I mean, that we're fighting Russia and with, 3% of the budget with 3% of the budget and no U.S. soldiers being killed. So, the West does not care at all about Ukrainians. Now, the puppet government, Zelensky, which has been puppet since 2014 when the U.S. took it over, like you were saying before. And when the democratically elected leader was overthrown in 2014, it wasn't just like that the U.S. selected the next president. We also put in into senior positions within all the departments of the government, foreigners, Westerners who basically were organizing the government and the way that the West wanted. We also, the U.S. went in like the next day after they overthrew the Democratic president in 2014, and the CIA was called in to completely reorganize the Ukraine's intelligence services and bring them under control. So Ukraine's incredibly, they suppress the people greatly, and there's the polling shows that basically only like a quarter of Ukrainians want to continue this war at all, but the people who are in charge in Ukraine, they want to continue it because it's a money machine for them, and because they're basically ordered to do so, and so they will keep fighting, and rule by martial law and by keeping.
Well, let's not forget, Ukraine has got a long history of overthrowing its rulers. Look what happened to Yanukovych. When Right Sector and all these other neo-nationalist groups had enough of him, he had to flee to his dacha in Kharkiv because they were trying to kill him. So let's face it, if Zelensky was suddenly to wave the white flag now, there'd be a lot of people in Ukraine, not just overseas, but very right-wing neo-nationalist groups that would be infuriated with Zelensky. They probably lost about 1 million men dead and wounded. That's not to mention the amount of people who are deserting the Ukrainian military, trying to flee abroad, the cities destroyed. How can you wave the white flag after that and face no ramifications by your own countrymen? Not to forget, he ran on a peace platform.
Exactly. Well, he's gonna golden parachute out of that country as soon as things get difficult. Now, and a lot of what the West has been planning, we've known about for a long time. Like, in the long term, like as the Ukrainian military falls apart, once it's like, basically, starts to collapse, which it seems like it's almost doing now, because they're having a hard time plugging holes, and Russia's, doing a great, is doing massive damage. I would say that the Russians are dying at an accelerated rate, and right now compared to, the Ukrainians are dying at a much faster rate than the Russians right now. It might be, it's more than 5 to 1. It's probably more like 10, 15 to 1 at this point, at right now in the war. Now, what the goal, the West is always viewed that, like, when Ukraine collapses from the U.S., from the West, they're in support of Ukraine. Once the army is destroyed by Ukraine, then all those nationalists, they're going to be used by the CIA to continue a insurgency. They're going to be supplied by the United States, the CIA, to basically to be a terrorist network across Ukraine, so that once their army is destroyed, they'll be fighting that's continued in a clandestine way.
Was that, sorry for interrupting, was that not in the document by the Rand Corporation overextending Russia into favourable territory, where they thought that Russia would overextend itself, be forced to occupy territories of like Kiev and Lviv, territories that are not pro-Russian, like the Donbass. There are Russian-speaking peoples there that many consider they are being liberated by the Russian Federation, but the cities like Lviv and Kiev, they are neo-nationalist Ukrainian strongholds. They are patriotic Ukrainians that don't, by and large, want to be part of Russia. And so for Russia to occupy huge swathes of Western Ukraine, west of the Dnipro River, it would overextend them. And they do document that was their plan and how they would win this war, but it would be through attrition by virtue of Russia occupying Ukraine. And it appears to me at the least that the Russians are aware of this, and that's why they're not overextending themselves. That is why they're operating within the territories where you do see a significant number of Russian-speaking peoples, like Sumy, like Kharkiv, like Donetsk. They're not overextending west of the Dnipro. That's not saying that we won't say cross and try and take Odessa at some point, because that is considered a Russian city. But what you were saying there about Russia and an occupation and an insurgency, we have documented that it was their intention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people are keep being like, well, see, Russia hasn't gained any land. It's almost as if the West is like egging on Russia to like, you should do a big push,
Yeah.
Go for it,
Mm-hmm.
and Russia's like, why? What they've been sitting back, and Ukraine is instead of Russia moving to where the enemy is, Ukraine's moving its forces to the front line as Russia defeats wave after wave, and Russia will move a little bit, and then when Ukrainian reinforcements come in, they'll move back, and then they'll hit those reinforcements, and they'll do a back and forth, and meanwhile Ukraine just keeps sending more people in, like, to where the Russians are. And that's why the line hasn't moved, is because they're able to attrit them where they are. The whole country's forces, Ukrainian forces, move to where the Russians are, and that's where they want to hit them. They don't want to keep moving across the line, so they're going to do that and do that. And you can see Ukraine's falling apart. The West talks about like these long range, missiles and drones that Ukraine is supposed to use. Of course, Russia uses way more than Ukraine will ever be able to match, and they're way more effective, and Ukraine doesn't have any air defenses anymore. But when you're at the point where all you're talking about is long range fire, and you're not talking about the short range situation, that's a sign that the war isn't going well for you, and that you can't, because they don't want to emphasize that part, and that means that, like, we can see that this whole Ukraine's military is going down.
I mean, they don't have dominance on the land. They don't have dominance in the air. How can you wage an effective war, an effective campaign, if you don't have dominance in any area? I mean, they have acquired dominance over the Black Sea, and they have been successful in moving the Russian Navy from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, which is about the only success I can see of Ukraine in the last couple of years. As we know, we had that great push in 2023, in summer 2023, where we tried to break through to Tokmak, sever the Zaporizhzhia land bridge, and we thought from there we could retake Crimea. And it was sheer fantasy, sheer pie in the sky. How do you expect to take Crimea without an air force, without any dominance in the air? It's one thing for the United States and for the United Kingdom to supply you with, effective missiles, but you need more than missile technology to take and hold territory. And it's like they just haven't thought this through. And here's a short clip.
Wait. The West did think this through. Okay, let's clarify this. The West knew that, like, there's no way that Ukraine would be able to beat Russia. That's insane. I mean, it was insane the first day, right? I mean, Russia's just so much larger and so much stronger that there's just no way that as long as Russia was determined, that it wouldn't win against Ukraine. So the West knew that from the beginning. And the West knew, I mean, from the beginning, that the only way, and Ukraine knew this too, the only way that Ukraine could win against Russia is with NATO and the U.S. boots on the ground, basically. That there was zero chance from the very start that Ukraine could win without that happening. So let's like, so they know, and they just don't care. That's why I think it's important to clarify.
I do think there was a level of hubris of certain military officials, because they were successful in the in the summer of 2022 and retaken Kharkiv back. And don't forget, they took Kherson City back west of the Dnipro. So I think because they had that initial success and taken quite a significant amount of territory back in the summer of 2022, they may have thought that the Russian lines, the Russian defences would have just collapsed in the subsequent summer of 2023. But as we know, the Russians were better prepared. They had created lines of defence. They had created Dragon's Teeth. They had air power already and willing. I can remember watching that footage of the Russian attack helicopters just firing missiles, destroying the incoming Ukrainian tanks, and it was like lambs to the slaughter. It was, and I think it was the US State Department that said there were up to 120,000 Ukrainian casualties in the offensive of 2023. So again, it boggles the mind. But I do think there was some hubris on,
definitely
of people like General Petraeus. I think I saw General Petraeus. I think it was an interview with ABC. Yeah. And he was saying the same nonsense he was saying in 2023 about how all the Ukrainians would have to do was maintain their effort and they could retake Crimea. This is, and now he's saying similar 2 years later, if we just tighten the sanctions on Russia, we're going to, their economy is going to collapse. Well, why didn't you do this years ago? If all you had to do was tighten sanctions, why haven't you already tightened them? Come on.
You're certainly right. I mean, I don't want to disregard that. The hubris is insane of our elites. I mean, these people, the billionaires that control are the West, basically, and their think tanks and the leadership and the armed forces of the West, and they think that they're just, their hubris is insane. They think that they're like ordained by God to rule the world, more or less, and that they're the smartest people in the world, and everybody should basically serve them, and because and that's who they're surrounded by, people who serve them or kiss their butts. So of course they are insanely out of touch with reality, and they just,
there's a lot of Russophobia in the UK. See, in organisations like MI5, MI6, if you listen to the British media, it is more Russophobic than the American media. When you think you've got Russophobia in the United States, over here it is mainstream. And I don't know if it goes back to the 19th century with Britain taking on Russia and the Crimean War or something like that, and they just haven't licked their wounds enough from getting beaten by the Russians in the 19th century. I don't know personally, but there is a lot of Russophobia, and with the talk of mobilisation and conscription, and there's a lot of people who are right up for that, who are up for seeing their sons being sent off to Ukraine. Yeah, as mad as it sounds, and it really shows how successful media is and planting these seeds that grow and can carry significant power over people's minds. But there's a clip I want to play of Lavrov, and it's him being interviewed on ABC recently. I don't know if you've seen this interview. But...
President Putin said clearly that he is ready to meet, provided this meeting is really going to have an agenda, presidential agenda.
So that's a big if. There's no meeting planned, Mr. Foreign Minister. That's a big if. You're saying there's no meeting planned right now.
Kristen, I am awfully sorry, you're not listening. There is no meeting planned, and I'm not challenging this. But you cannot, I think, understand what I am saying. Putin is ready to meet with Zelensky when the agenda would be ready for a summit. And this agenda is not ready at all. President Trump suggested, after Anchorage, several points which we share. And on some of them, we agreed to show some flexibility.
Okay, so whereas Lavrov kind of getting into a bit of a tussle with American journalists trying to get answers from him regarding Putin having a trilateral meeting with Zelensky and Trump. Why do you think that's so important to Trump that Putin and Zelensky sit down and get this meeting?
I mean, it's tough to know. I think earlier, like a few months ago, I was just so worn out by following Trump on this issue, that and other issues, frankly, the way he seems to flip flop back and forth, that it's just so much noise, not enough substance. It was the same with Biden. It's like these, Trump is a reality TV star. I mean, he, we have he doesn't have a lot of skills in there. The U.S. isn't really led by, like Russia is led by its government. Okay. The United States is not led by its government, and that's like kind of the big difference, I think, now between the West and like the BRICS nations, or at least some of the BRICS nations, like Russia and China. Russia and China have their governments are in charge, and and Putin, well, in 2003, he threw the richest guy in Russia. He's like, throw him in jail for 10 years, basically, and got all the other billionaires, threw a couple more, but got all the rest in line. Said, here, you can be rich, you can be filthy rich, but you have no say in for government. And that's what, and when they talk about Russian oligarchs, they were talking about in the 90s, not during Russia's time, especially not these days, right? So when the U.S. went in there and they thought like the oligarchs would rise up against Putin because of how much money they're losing, and it didn't happen, they're like, what? And that's same with China. You have Xi Jinping, and he goes in there and he's held billionaires to account whenever they try to meddle with government. Like, there's a separation. You cannot interfere. Your wealth does not allow you to dictate how our nation is run. And in all the Western governments, that's the key difference. The United States, it's like the billionaires dictate how the government is run. It's just
and if you think about it, that could be very relevant in terms of this war, because if you're talking about billionaires and the influence they wield in the corporations that they represent, you're looking at a nation state, Russia, with resources in the tens of trillions, and with Russia expanding into the Donbass and also into the Arctic, that's tens of trillions more. So for the elites and the Anglo-American corporations that especially represent fossil fuel companies, Russia's prime real estate.
Yeah, and Russia, when they talk about Russia, for the West, the heyday that for Russia and U.S. relations, Russia's relations with the West was back in the 90s. And of course, for Russians, the 90s were a decade of death and misery. People, the average population, the age of people, the death age of people dropped by 6 years. People died 6 years younger during the 90s because of how bad it got there, the transition to a market-based economy. And that's when all the West loved it, because they just went in there with their corporations and started buying up everything hand in hand with the most corrupted people in that country, which they helped to elevate to the oligarch billionaires. Mm-hmm. So now they can't do that, and they wanted to be able to do that again, right? That's why they want to get rid of Putin, for example, and they want to break up Russia because they're tired of it didn't work just to Yeltsin, Clinton actually helped get Yeltsin's elected the second time around. It was like the U.S. interfering in Russia's election back in the 90s. That actually happened. Mm-hmm. And Putin was accused of interfering back in 2016 with Trump. And that's the start of when the U.S. started to act Russophobic and started hating Putin and more energetically. But that was all just a total lie, right? But it's not as deep in the U.S. like it is in the UK, like you were saying. So, that's that's the difference, between us and them to some degree, and that's and we really, the U.S. aims for external exploitation. And that's one of the fears I have of why I think nuclear war is on the table. In my opinion, the Western world hegemonic order is clearly, it's on the decline, right? We financialize the economy, which we have, our economy is fake. It's like we have, for the United States, we have the debts are seen as are part of the GDP, right? All these corporations, all the banks, all the debts that they hold, that's seen as positive to the GDP, what's owed them, even though right, their debts. So we have all these fake derivatives. All of our bad assets are mixed with the few good assets we have. So we're having this period economically where we're looking at possibly a bubbles. That's what people are talking about right now. And you don't have that problem in like Russia and China. They are trying to avoid the neoliberalization of their economy. They're trying to avoid financialization and falling to pitfalls of over speculation, and that's why Russia has very little debt right now, and this is and they have such big foreign reserves that the West is trying to confiscate. So I mean, that it's a different order, and that scares the heck out of all of the West, because they let their countries, the infrastructure decay so much that they can't compete fairly. They all are.
Well, I do want to get into the BRICS and the seeming rivalry with aspirations of the BRICS group and the G7 in the West. However, I want to turn it a bit more to the coalition of the willing, because this is something that it really, really concerns me, because I don't know how much you're hearing about it in the United States, but in Europe, they are really prepping this. In Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, and you alluded to this earlier when you said it's Ukraine that benefits from the ceasefire, because Ukraine right now is losing, and Russia's military has expanded. I think it was Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, who said that Russia produces more in 3 months, more munitions in 3 months than all of the NATO nations do in a year. Yep. Right now, when you take that into consideration, and also the levels of desertions, casualties in the Ukrainian military, and there are so many people to this day who still buy the media narrative that Ukraine isn't losing this war and there's no manpower issue. And if that's the case, why is Ukraine conscripting men 16 above, age 16 above? What do you think a military, an army composed of men age 16 above, how effective do you believe that military is going to be? And do you think that a nation state that isn't suffering a manpower issue would be doing that? Of course not.
Yeah, of course not.
Yeah, so Ukraine is the state that would really benefit from a ceasefire. But what they would benefit even more from is the coalition of the willing, the UK, France, Germany, putting tens of thousands of soldiers on the ground, building up the defences, entrenching themselves in case there's a future outbreak of conflict. And they'd be all along that line. But what would worry me is all Ukraine would have to do is break that ceasefire. And as the coalition would already be in Ukraine, we would then be caught up in a war, a fighting war between the coalition, the Ukrainians and the Russians. And we know Ukraine intends at least at one point to retake the Oblasts Russia has taken, because I played the clip of Zelensky just saying there that Ukraine will never recognize Russian ownership or de jure control over the Donbass territories. Perhaps de facto, if they really sign up to an agreement, but never de jure, and that's a very significant difference. So I'm supposed to put my faith in the Ukrainian government or military that when tens of thousands of British soldiers are deployed to Ukraine, but the Ukrainians won't break the ceasefire. I mean, I don't think so. You know, I don't have faith in Ukrainian leadership at some point in the future not to break that ceasefire. Because if it did, we know that the Western media would be saying, oh, it's the Russians, it was the Russians, you know, they would back Ukraine regardless. So I know I went on a bit of a rant there, but what do you think about this coalition of the willing and the potential for it to escalate into a greater conflict, pulling NATO?
I definitely would be. I mean, you know, I wrote an article about March of 2024, so about almost a year and a half ago, and it was about how, you know, basically it reflected on Biden's speech back in 2024 about how he, you know, he mentions in the very first paragraph, he talks about how, you know, he references the speech of a former president's State of the Union from Roosevelt's back in 1941. Okay, and Roosevelt's speech back in 1941 was basically, he referenced that very first paragraph. I went back and read that because it basically says that the U.S. needs to prepare for war with Europe. We need to escalate all of our manufacturing weapons because we are going to war. It's going to happen, so we need to get everybody on board. We need to unite the differences between the parties. We need to get all our capitalists on board. We need to get the labor unions on board. And that's what the speech from 1941 by Roosevelt, of course. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, right? And so I was expecting some sort of Pearl Harbor-like event to happen to drag the U.S. into war, direct conflict to some degree with Russia. Now, we had a change in government, right? We had, Trump came in and instead of the Democrats' preferred candidate, but there was escalation in December that seemed where the U.S. was sending in long-range missiles which were crossing Russia's red lines, and we were on the brink to some degree last end of November, early December of possible nuclear war. And it was, really just took like, it was Putin holding, firm that something like that didn't happen. So, my theory, my from what I can see, the idea is that we're following almost the World War II playbook. So first, would be the first thing people to go in will have to be the European countries coalition of the willing, right? And it'll be the little states, and then France, and then England, and then later with Poland. And Poland's like, oh, we're not gonna send any troops in, right? And there's a reason for that. It's not because they aren't on board with what's happening. It's because Poland is strategically important that they are seen as not a combat zone, because that's where they need to stage all these forces, right? And so that's why Poland's like, no, we're not going to be involved, even though they've been sending tens of thousands of troops have been going in from Poland already, actually, into the Ukraine conflict. But so that they strategically need to remain neutral. All right. So after the England and France gets in there and starts sending its forces in, then will come Germany. Germany will start sending its forces in. And then after that, and the U.S. is going to do what it did back in 1941, which is arm them to fight. At the time, it was to fight the Nazis, but today it's to support the Nazis to some degree. But like they're going to arm them, which is what they're all saying. That's what Trump is saying now. Europe's going to buy our weapons.
He's going to provide some air support. I think I heard him.
Yeah, supposedly, but we'll see. He's backing off. He can always go back in. That's the problem with Trump. He backs off, and then he can always come right back.
Well, is that going to be any different to the Russians, whether it's American boots on the ground or American air power? The Russians, it's not going to be any different to the Russians. The Russians are going to shoot down those American jets if those F-35s or Raptors are over Kiev or over Zaporizhzhia. We're going to get shot down, and then that's going to be a direct shooting war.
And the U.S. is threatening, basically I mean, the stuff that they did against Iran, you see what U.S. did to Iran, also what Israel did, with that, using these decapitation hits, and we have that B-2 bombers flying overhead of Russia. That's a reference to what happened where the U.S. sent, the B-2 to go and bomb Iran's nuclear sites, right? So, they're basically sending a message to Russia that we're going to decapitate you. That's what the whole Medvedev and Trump discussion was about how, the U.S. was giving off signs that it was talking about, and subtly, like decapitation strike against Russia. And Medvedev was saying, we've got the dead hand, which would launch nuclear missiles if there's a decapitation strike.
Well, I mean, you did see something that could have been interpreted like that, Operation Spiderweb, where you saw the Russian nuclear triad, not the entire triad, but vernacular bombers get attacked.
Exactly. I mean, we can go back further to that. Go back to last fall with Biden. That's why there's this continuity of agenda, when it comes to this stuff. Because last fall the Ukrainians hit like some strategic radar bases in Russia that were strategic radar bases. They were the ones that were able to see over the horizon ballistic missiles before and the interesting thing about that is those were pointing south. They're pointing towards Iran, towards Israel, that direction. And Ukraine shot, basically hit 2 of them. Now that's hitting a strategic nuclear, asset for Russia, and that was way back then, and so Russia is noting this stuff, and of course, and by the way, the spiderweb strikes, that it ended up that those were not very effective. They hit a few, maybe 7.
It may not have been effective, but it was a provocation. I believe they did that to get Russia to provoke Russia into retaliation.
But if it had been fully effective, the way that it was set up to be, because it was supposed to hit like 5 sites. I think they only were able to hit 2, and that was be able to hit. And they had 100 drones for each site. Now, if those had all hit their targets and had done significant damage to the strategic forces, that would have been a major escalation. So, and Russia might have been forced to respond in ways that the U.S. is not ready for. Now, I mean, I think the Rezhnik is actually a very interesting weapon. I think that's what stopped the U.S. from pushing forward to some degree with its long-range missile attacks through Ukraine into Russia, because the Rezhnik actually, I think they acted like it didn't do anything, but I have the feeling that plant that it hit in Ukraine was utterly destroyed just from the impact level going Mach 10.
Well, they have deployed. They have also deployed the Ureshnik in Belarus now, so the missile is even closer to NATO countries. So if that Ureshnik was to be fired from Belarus, how long do you think it would take for that missile to hit Berlin?
Yeah,
we're talking about
5 minutes.
If even that.
Not even that. Yeah.
So to engage in a form of Russian roulette provocations with a country with that kind of missile technology, it's a gloom prospect. And to see primarily the British, the French, and the Germans potentially being sent to Ukraine while our social services are they're being gutted in Europe. I mean, according to the UK House of Commons Library, it's something like 15 billion that has been given to Ukraine. The Chancellor of Germany, Merz, on the same day he announced that 9 billion euros was to be pledged to Ukraine. He said that the welfare system of Germany could no longer be maintained. Think about that. The very same day he pledged 9 billion to Ukraine, he turned around to the German people and said, "No, see your welfare. We can maintain the money to Ukraine, but we can't maintain a welfare state, to you." And so it's not sustainable. For the Germans, it's sustainable. But you've got the EU, 170 billion given to Ukraine, 15 billion from UK, with another 3 billion pledged every few months. You've got BAE Systems in the UK, Rheinmetall in Germany. Their sales, their contracts are just skyrocketing now. They are getting ready. They're getting ready. I don't think this war's coming to an end. I think it's, yeah. I think these are the birth pangs of an even greater conflict, we're going to see.
Oh yeah. And like I said, and this has been terrifying me since basically the start, since 2022, that it was just inevitable. The only way that Ukraine could win was if NATO and eventually, first Europe and then the US, got involved. And that's been the plan, that if they were to continue, of course they could call it off, and these plans, like you were saying before, there is immense hubris, and their opponents, their enemies, have their own moves that they make. They're not just sitting there and waiting for these attacks, right? And that's why Russia's doing, it's doing a good job of countering what the vision that the West wanted of its destruction. So it's doing a great job of that, and the BRICS nations as well, right? Now, the thing is, though, I think that one of the problems is that because the Western hegemonic order is an empire that's falling, right? It's falling, and the BRICS are nations that are on the rise, and they know that they're on the rise, and the West knows it's on decline, and so for the BRICS, they have the priority. They have it's rational for them to try and prevent war, right? Because they know that if they can just keep developing themselves and building their strength individually as countries and then together, then eventually, as the West declines, they, if they can prevent the war from happening, the big war that the West wants from happening, then eventually the West will have to come to terms with the fact that they can't win that conflict. Now,
I remember hearing one time, if you're losing the peace, the only way is to start a war.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at the UK. There was an article in the Telegraph yesterday about how the UK government is going to ask IMF for a bailout.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the UK is pledging $3 billion to Ukraine every few months. Yeah. Do you know how much the bailout we're allegedly going to be requesting? $3 billion. So we need to request a $3 billion bailout from the IMF, but we've got that money to give to pledge to Ukraine.
And to some degree, they're using the IMF in a certain way, right? Because IMF gave Ukraine money, right? They made them loans, even though there's no way on earth Ukraine meets the criteria that the IMF would need in order to like lend them money at all. So the IMF is just a puppet of the West. It's hardly even used anymore to some degree. But the IMF, instead of like giving money directly to Ukraine, they're going to give $3 billion to England, to the UK, and then the UK is going to give $3 billion to Ukraine, right? So then the IMF says like, look, now the UK is on the hook for that $3 billion because they just don't feel comfortable with sending it directly to Ukraine because they know that Ukraine's going to lose.
I don't know, but all I know is we have stagnant growth, if any growth at all, in France.
Exactly.
Germany and Britain. I think the French government's collapsing the French Parliament's collapsed or something like that, and it's got to do with a financial and it's got to do with our economy. So there is a financial, economic stagnation in France, same in Germany, in the UK. Yet that money, that wheel just keeps on turning, and Project Ukraine, it doesn't cease. And again, when you look at, and this is what really worries me, if you look at how the European nations and the United States got out of the Great Depression in the 30s. It was through, arms,
World War.
militarization of the economy. It's what's happening here now.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, to the last point on what I was saying before, the Western decline, what that means that they see that their empire is going down. And so the thing is they also know that if they don't act quickly to use their last basically remaining their last remaining benefit, their last trump card, so to speak, which is their huge, enormous military. So the U.S. with its 800 foreign military bases and all the weapons that it has and the nuclear weapons, if they don't use that sooner than later, then that all that spent money for years on building this enormous empire militarily will be for naught, because they won't be able to keep pace keeping that up anymore, and they'll have to basically fold it down. And that's why they're like, we need to act now. We need to act in this year or by 2027. And they also believe that the thing is as well, and this is where I think is important, is these billionaires that run the West, they don't give a crap about us cockroaches, So they have bunkers. They live on islands. They live in New Zealand. They live in Hawaii. They are protected. They think that they're protected. So for the Western elite, what they want to see done, and they're also, there's lots of documents talk about how these people think that the Earth is overpopulated as well. Because and of course there's AI, right? There's the robots that they have. They realize that there's going to be people are going to be demanding jobs, and the jobs are going to go away, and so they want to see the population of the world go down. They're also worried about climate change. I mean, legitimately, it's on their mind. The ecology. They see just overall. They think that the whole world with 8 billion people cannot support the standards of the West. Of people living like people live in the West. So their idea of that is to reduce population 90%.
It's interesting. It's interesting how you said
last point, real quick. Well, okay, last little note, which is just that, like I said, so the Western elites, when I say that they want to reduce population by 90%, so their goal when the idea of a fight against China and Russia, for example, and they'd have to hit India as well, because they've got nukes, is not to win. It's to take out more of their industrial capacity and more of their high tech and set them back more than they get set back. Knowing that that they retain a higher level of capacity for their industry and for their science and all that sort of stuff.
Are you saying this will happen with nuclear weapons?
I think potentially.
Or is this what the speculation is? The scenario is that we're going to use the nuclear weapons to destroy industry and population zones. Is that what you're speculating? Yeah.
Well, here's okay. Yes, to some degree. Now, I had a big thought about this. I think people know what this idea that there would be nuclear winter, and you see that the West is talking about tactical nukes. The West is the one talking about tactical nukes. The West is the one that's pulled out of all these nuclear treaties with Russia. It's the West that's doing that. The West under Obama was spending $2 trillion on upgrading its nuclear weapons. So and there's plenty of times in America's history where the thought of using nuclear bombs was very much on the table. I mean, it was on the table during Korea, during Vietnam. It was on the table right after the end of World War II to strike the USSR. I mean, it was on the table to hit China way back then. I mean, so it's on the table. And here's what I'll say. I'm more but it does seem insane, right? So there's this part of me is are they that insane? And I'm going to say slightly no on that, because here's what I think is the goal is. I think the goal, and you can see there's military, they say this in the policy papers in the military, that the goal is that the U.S. wants to have space, total domination of the domain of space. And if they're able, and China's catching up right now on the U.S.'s control of space. So the U.S. wants total domination of space. And if you have total domination of space, you can do a lot. So when we look at right now what the U.S. is doing, they're building the Golden Dome. Now, Golden Dome is supposed to be space-based weapons. We don't know exactly what it all means, but some part of it's going to be space-based weapons. Now, are these going to be purely defensive weapons in space, or are they going to be offensive weapons? And that relates back to this concept that comes out in the 60s called the Rods of God. Rods of God was developed in the 60s. It was a way of basically changing the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, because it was kind of like the Rezhnik, okay, where it would use, basically, it would launch a tungsten rod the size of like a telephone pole straight down from space, and the kinetic energy of it going Mach 10 would be able to bunker bust nuclear silos and other places around the world. So you'd be able to do decapitations, you'd be able to hit ships, and you'd be able to hit nuclear silos and strategic targets. So if you get enough of those into space, then you could conceivably, using kinetic energy alone, you could take out all of your enemies' nuclear strategic weapons, or not all of them. There's no way you could take out all of them, but you could take out enough of them plus a decapitation strike. But it'd have to be a surprise attack, a first strike. Now, of course, we can't. We look at Israel. Israel does first strike, surprise attacks, right? And so the United States is not against the first strike surprise attack. It's in our nuclear doctrine to some degree. So that would be kinetic space weapons. And the thing is, the problem with those weapons is that they weigh an enormous amount. So back in the 60s, when they were talking about it, they were like, oh, this would cost like $300 million per rod, and we'd need to get like thousands of them up in space. So what has the U.S. been building? We just had a recent, what did Trump just launch recently? He's launched the Starship. The Starship can lift up 150,000 tons to 300,000 tons of material into orbit. Most of the time, the Falcon rockets, other rockets that the U.S. and other countries use, they usually lift like 6 tons into space in a launch instead of 150 or 300. Right? It's hard to get things that weigh a lot. So you have a God of Rod that might weigh upwards of like 20,000 pounds, or whatever, but each. If you're able to get the Starship, the Elon Musk Starship, going at the launching at the rate that the Falcon 9 rocket is launching, which is right now the Falcon 9 is launching over 100 rockets a year, half of them for the military or more. And so if you got the Starship doing that, within a year, you would have enough of these potential weapons to be able to dominate space and be able to, hit those targets without them being able to do much of a response. So, and of course, it's controlled by billionaires.
Didn't we have a back and forth there between Medvedev and Donald Trump over something like this, where the Russians were alluding to the dead hand, and Medvedev was saying, essentially, we've got this in case there is a first strike in the future. It doesn't matter if it's a space-based first strike, land-based, air-based. This system is operational. It's been operational for a long time. And if you take us out of the Kremlin, this machine is operable, and you will be completely destroyed.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. So when you have right now, and that's what mutually assured deterrence is we've got the ability to strike back. If you hit us first, we can strike back with nukes. But if you have these rods of God or something similar to it, and you're able to, and so remember, these are traveling around the Earth 20,000 kilometers the speed of 20,000 kilometers per hour or whatever. And so they're just circling around the Earth. You have thousands of these up in space, which could happen fairly quickly, if once they get the Starship going, launching twice a week. I think they're already talking about launching that twice a week. So we're talking about sending 15 up every 30 up a week. You do that for 100 times or 50 times. We're getting really high in the numbers, right? And you cannot intercept these, okay? Because Mach 10 straight down, and they're bunker busters. So the dead hand. The thing is that you're hitting all at once. Within 15 minutes, these are launching straight down from space.
They may not be able to. Sorry for interrupting, but they may not be able to intercept them, but there would be a retaliation, an immediate retaliation on the homeland.
Well, but if we knock out 80% of their nuclear weapons, they would. Okay, and remember, if it's a surprise, it'd have to be a surprise attack. We knock out like all their silos, or like 80% of their silos with these things, bunker busted. Their nukes are gone in these silos, right? And we didn't use a single nuke, right? So we didn't use any nukes. So now, Russia's in a little bit of a quandary, and we'd have to hit China at the same time. So, but because we didn't use any nukes, and their doctrine is like, we'll not be the first to use nukes, then their secondary, would they even launch the secondary? Because plus, if we did a surprise attack, we've got our planes in the air with with rockets able to shoot down incoming stuff. We got 2,000 planes in there ready to shoot down rockets that are incoming, plus all of our anti-missile systems on full alert. Okay, we got our nukes, nuclear armed submarines ready to go, and we did not fire a nuke first. We just took out their nukes from space in a surprise attack. Okay, so it becomes difficult to understand what the response will be.
Well,
right?
what about NATO assets?
If Russia launched its nukes at that point, let's say we were able to take out 3/4 of their nuclear arsenal. So but we never launched a single nuke. So then what they're going to fire their last quarter of nuclear weapons at us while we are sitting there with ready to shoot down anything that comes our way, and we have our entire nuclear arsenal ready to be fired. So this is the stuff.
Do you know you say this? You're saying this, and last night the film that I watched was On the Beach with Gregory Peck and Anthony Perkins. Do you remember that? The 50s On the Beach.
50s On the Beach?
No, the 1950s film On the Beach, but based on the book On the Beach by Neville Shute. Have you seen it?
I don't know. Maybe I've seen bits and pieces of it.
But basically, the basis of it is there is a nuclear war between Russia and NATO, and the Northern Hemisphere is devastated, destroyed. However, those in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand, are alive, but there's a radiation wave making its way down, and like in a month, everyone in Australia will die. And so they're all getting prepared and ready for the incoming wave of radiation that will spell the doom of the population. And it's a phenomenal film about how people are essentially coping with the fact that they are in the apocalypse, they are in Armageddon, and they only have so much time to live before the radiation takes hold. And it's terrible. It's a terrible film how the government has to provide the population with cyanide pills, and the families are discussing about giving it to their children and stuff like that.
I need to watch this.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to the second part of The Day After, the nuclear war film made in the 80s. The second part of The Day After is after the nuclear bombs have dropped and detonated and stuff. But yeah, it's a 50s film. Gregory Peck, the star in Psycho, Anthony, is it Perkins or something? I can't remember his name. You know who I'm talking about? The crazy guy.
Yeah.
He's very young in it. He's like 1920. But it's a phenomenal film. You should check it. And you're talking about nuclear war and how America would maintain this first strike ability. And it's that sort of hubris that I was alluding to earlier, the belief that we're ahead and we have this technology, and that even believing that, I think, is you don't want to go there. Because there'll be a Russian response. They're going to have to invest in new technologies to counter this. And it's taken us into levels where, I can't imagine.
It's the silence on the issue that almost gives away that this is like a high that the powers that be, the powers behind the powers, are, kind of see this as something that could very possibly happen. It's, it's not written in stone. I don't think any of this is written in stone, but I think that there's a good chance. But, and that's when I say the silence about it, nobody's talking about how close we are to nuclear war. You have the League of Atomic Scientists, they did their doomsday clock. It's the closest to midnight ever it has been. And yet, this isn't front page stories. Back in the 50s, people were doing drills, getting under a desk or whatever nonsense like that. People were building bunkers, they were digging out bunkers, and, all over the world. And it was serious business. There, like the newspapers were talking about it, being like articles about it. Serious people were talking about this stuff, about the risks, because it looked like we were close to nuclear war a couple times during the Cold War as well. And now no one's talking about it, even though we are extremely close. Okay, and that's because it's being kept. We're being kept from talking about it. Now in Russia, back in late November, early December, while after those the U.S. allowed the long range missile strikes under Biden, that they allowed the long range missile strikes to hit Russia. The Russians, the government was basically sending in containers that were set up as fallout shelters to help people survive the first nuclear blast. It's not gonna, it wasn't stocked to keep you in long run, but it might protect you from the first.
Well, these ATACMS that America was giving Ukraine, authorization to use, they could be nuclear tipped, couldn't they? They could be.
I don't think that those could be nuclear tipped, but a lot of the missiles could be. But basically, when we say we give them to Ukraine, we have, it's 100% the US or NATO person has to. They basically type in the codes. They have to fire it. They have to aim
there was a big scandal over here where there was pressure on the then Chancellor of Germany. His name escapes me. But he didn't give authorization for the German Taurus missile to be used. And he said, in front of the media, that the reason is because it would require German special forces to be on the ground in Ukraine to operate them, just like the British special forces are on the ground operating and putting in the codes for the British Storm Shadow missiles to be used. Yeah. And this caused a big thing in the UK, with the UK government going, shh, you're not supposed to acknowledge that we have special forces operating in the Ukraine. And, that was last year. And,
well, this summer, it wasn't talked about much in the UK, but the US decided that we're going to send over nuclear bombs to the UK. Those are gravity bombs. And they're being staged at Ukraine air bases right now. And this is like a month ago. Why on earth do we do that? We haven't done that in 20 years, over 20 years. And all of a sudden we're doing this now, and we're talking about all this, sending nuclear subs. So, all this stuff is on the table. And these and it was interesting. By the way, mentioning like the how the northern hemisphere, that would be where all the radiation is, because of how the currents cycle in the north and in the south. They go opposite directions, and like basically the equator is a dividing line. The atmosphere in the northern hemisphere doesn't really mix with the southern atmosphere, and there's not going to be any nukes necessarily in the southern hemisphere. So, the southern hemisphere might do okay, except for, of course, the nuclear winter problem, but, these crazy billionaires, they don't care, they just don't care. And, and by the way, we love, if nukes start happening, or like these rods of God or whatever, you know, we're going to see chemical, biological weapons. You want to see all sorts of stuff come out of the woodwork from everybody.
It's Pandora's box. Once one nuclear weapon is used, Pandora's box is opened, and there's no going back.
Yeah.
Any talk of like,
look at Israel, right? I mean, come on, right? I mean, like in these, and look, the Zionists, you know, of Israel, and you probably might be a little worried about me saying anything here, but let's hope that the censors don't hear it till now. But the Zionists, in my opinion, it's totally different. In my opinion, the Zionists want to connect Judaism with Israel and Zionism, and for me, I'm like, no, totally different. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is a political theory. Because like, if you can be Catholic like Biden and also be a Zionist, then Zionism is not the same as Judaism, right?
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to clarify that. But Zionists, and one of the reasons why I specifically say Zionism is built into that, I think, is like if you look into like what some of these folks believe, that's where it's more heavy on the chosen people stuff and like how they're elites and they use weird texts that basically it's a philosophy that's not of Jews. It's a philosophy of power. So that's why you see all the billionaires.
It's a philosophy of supremacy.
Of
if you believe you are chosen by God, how is that any different from believing you're genetically superior to other peoples and races?
And it's tied into aristocracy in the UK, and it's tied into like the billionaires, across the West. It's like they all are. So many of them, the vast majority, I think, are Zionists because because of the philosophy is the philosophy of power. It justifies the power, exactly like you were saying. And so, so the point is that I was trying to make was that you see how crazy these Israeli Zionists are, talking openly that like, this might be a time of like basically destruction, like 2/3 of the population of the world being destroyed. Like these are end times. I mean, these people are completely mad and nuts people, and they're pushing this idea right now. And these people. So there's the religious prophecies stuff that they're pushing, but it actually lines up with like the stated billionaires' beliefs on this sort of matter that like overpopulation of all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's so strange that you brought this up because I had a conversation with someone just a couple of hours ago, and they were discussing the rebuilding the construction of the third temple. And how they felt it would be good because it would usher in the end times and the world would be purified. And I'm like, well, that's good. What the hell are you talking about? I don't think that's good. I mean, the world might be a shithole, but I don't want the world to be, and humanity to be destroyed. It's not on my agenda, so to speak. but I'm going to need to wrap this one up because over here it's about 10:30 almost. So
Bruce, we've been talking for a while.
If there's anything you would like to promote or tell the audience about before we end this, like
well, I've got a website. It's brucecampaign.org. I don't post on there a whole lot, and you can find me on Facebook and on Twitter, X, whatever, at look up Be Wildleaf or look up Bruce Wilkinson. And I don't put out a whole lot of commentary all the time, so it was really fun to do this today. And and thank you so much. This is really fun, and we should do it again sometime.
Well, I have in the past. You moved to the subject of Israel, and I've got episodes up on Israel. And there will be more in the future. So if you want to contribute later,
sure. Of course, we can dive more. There's so much more to talk about with the Russia-Ukraine stuff too in the U.S. and this is a good station for it.
Well, it's been good having you on, and I'll see you next time you're on. Thanks for coming on.
All right, you have a wonderful day, man. Thanks a lot.
You too. Okay, everybody, that was interesting. It's always good to counter the mainstream narrative on Ukraine. It's pushed continuously, and it's good to hear new voices, different voices. So, if you enjoyed and appreciated, don't forget you can donate at Buy Me a Coffee or at Twitter, the cash tab icon. And don't forget to subscribe and like. And until next time, I will catch you later, and thanks for watching.
Gold pressed platinum, slip strips and bars. If you ever find some, you can lose it in quartz. Get a Ractogino, spin the double wheel. Order a black hole, just depends how you feel. Yeah, it just depends how you feel. Gold pressed platinum, you know it's a gas. Morn vomits it up into a tiny little glass. Liquid platinum, more you amass. Better than bronze, cobalt, silver, nickel or brass. Silver, nickel or brass. We're living in a high society, living on station. Part of the alliance, the United Federation. Picking up the pieces from the Cardi occupation.